Inside Florida Politics, powered by the USA Today Florida Network. Trump returns to power with a Make America Florida agenda. The president's immigration crackdown begins with many Florida residents in the crosshairs, and Ron DeSantis leads the way in adopting Trump's Gulf of America moniker. Hello, I'm USA Today reporter Zac Anderson, and those are some of the stories I'll be discussing this week with three great journalists, Goni-Lessan, Antonio Fins, and John Kennedy. Welcome, everyone. Well, the week began with a bang as we entered the new Trump era and saw the president quickly move to put his stamp on the federal government. Trump pardoned the J6 rioters and unleashed a torrent of executive actions. At his side was Chief of Staff Susie Wild and other Floridians that the new president raptured up to Washington, D.C. to implement his agenda. Yeah, that agenda actually looks a lot like what we've experienced in Florida in recent years under Ron DeSantis' culture war crusade. Trump's muscular approach to executive power also is very reminiscent of DeSantis. Antonio, is Florida the template for the new Trump era?
Well, in many ways it is. And one of the areas that we saw this week most prominently in some ways is the attack on diversity, inclusion, and equity programs across the federal government. And that is something that obviously Florida led the way in many ways. And in fact, that wasn't actually Trump who mentioned that, but the Governor Ron DeSantis, who you mentioned earlier, Zach, and he was the one that began the war on woke. And during the first Trump administration that began in 2017, that really wasn't the commentary. That really wasn't a lot of the language. And in fact, it was as Mr. Trump began his comeback campaign in 2022, he co-opted a lot of that language. And then we saw it get rolled out into policy this week, particularly with the rollback a lot of DEI programs across the federal government. And another area where we've seen Florida stamp, not so much in official policy, but in tone, has been the way that so many corporations, particularly big tech companies, have come to kiss the brass ring. We saw that in Florida with the way that Governor DeSantis went after Disney World opposed some of his policies. So in many ways, Florida has put a stamp on this, but I think it's worth mentioning in some ways it's a two-way street. You look at the way that Trump himself has changed politics in Florida. One area, immigration. This was very pro-immigration state, which we'll talk about in a bit. But really, Mr. Trump has kind of changed the viewpoint there as well. Another area is abortion. It was, Trump's quote-unquote Supreme Court that rolled back Roe versus Wade and allowed the 15-week ban and the 6-week ban in the state to hold. And then another area I'm kind of taking a look at is what happens now with drill baby drill and coastal drilling across Florida. The state has always been very much of a bipartisan stalwart to oppose drilling off its coast, both the Atlantic and in the Gulf of America, shall we say. But the state's politics have changed. The tourism industry, as we saw with Disney, is not as sacrosanct as it used to be. So the question is, does that bipartisan opposition still hold? So, yeah, I think you can say that Florida is the template, but it's also a two-way street.
Yeah, and Antonio, you mentioned DEI. That's been a huge focus of Trump as he starts out purging all these federal agencies of sort of these DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and laying people off. He also, in his executive orders, focused on transgender sports. We saw that. There's all these culture war things here. This was something that really, he wasn't talking about 8 years ago much at all. We saw DeSantis really focus on it, critical race theory, things like that, the transgender issue. Now we're seeing it. We also really saw Trump adopt that during his campaign. He really went hard. A lot of his campaign ads towards the end were focused on the transgender issue. There's all sorts of reasons why Trump may have that you could point to why Trump won this election. Inflation, other things, but he really seems to think that some of this culture war stuff is a winner for him.
Yeah, and it's playing very well across the country as well. These are issues that people have embraced, and I think you can perhaps make the argument that he moved in that direction to basically gut DeSantis's campaign, because remember the governor also was one of the early rival for the GOP nomination back in 2023, and he kind of co-opted the language and took away that lightning bolt from the governor. But turns out it has been very popular across much of red the United States. And the question is now, does it get applied to some of the blue states too? And I think some of these purple states are going to embrace it too. So clearly it is, they found a third rail of politics here, or maybe a fourth rail of politics that has proven very beneficial. And clearly, and it's an area, look, some of these other issues they're going to tackle are going to be very complicated. But removing DEI programs from the federal government registry is a low-hanging fruit.
These are messages that are very easy to hammer home and very easy for people to get. And it does seem like, and his branding of it has been, this is common sense. This is just why wouldn't we do this? He's really kind of made it seem like the Democrats are the the people that just don't have any common sense, and it seems to have worked for him so far. John, people are really wondering about what kind of guardrails Trump has at this point. How many of these policies are going to get through? What have we learned from DeSantis on this? Is it the courts? Is it the legislative branch? Is there likely to be a check on Trump here?
Well, yeah, there will be a check, and the guardrails for Trump, may eventually be Congress and the courts. Right now, he's able to do a lot of stuff by executive action, and he can go pretty far with that. But again, as you point out, some of it is some of this low-hanging stuff where it's a lot of popular kind of culture war issues that he can seize. But when he tries getting into legislation, there's a contrast between what Trump will be doing and what DeSantis was able to do, because DeSantis had overwhelming Republican majorities in the state legislature who willingly rolled over for whatever idea he advanced. He also played a powerful role in shaping the courts, the governor did. And while Trump also has installed conservative justices and judges, Republicans only have such a narrow margin in the U.S. House that any single GOP defection on a Trump proposal will likely doom it if Democrats unite in opposition. So while Republicans, they do have a better margin in the Senate, but between the Senate's filibuster rule and its history of finding some point to challenge the president, really, any president on many points of legislation, Trump may not proceed here with complete confidence either. So, while Florida is a template for a lot of what Trump has done and what Trump is looking to do on a national scale, the president doesn't have the advantages that DeSantis had, so that, that may become something of a guardrail once this early flurry of Trump adoration and executive action starts dying down.
And what did we see with DeSantis in some of these court cases, John? I mean, the CRT thing, some of these other things were challenged, and they've been appealed. There's been various court rulings, but most of them have been able to go into effect, right?
Most of them have been able to go into effect. Some have been, modified by the courts along the way, with ruling some portions of it out. I think, some of the DEI issues as they relate to the workplace, for example, were scaled back. But yeah, DeSantis was able to pretty much, again, because the kind of favorable courts in Florida, where the appeals court that hears a lot of state legislation is the First District Court of Appeal in Tallahassee, and all of its members have been appointed by Republican governors through the years. So there's a little bit of a like-minded symmetry there between the judges and the leaders. So that's helped. And then some other courts on the federal level where DeSantis has been stopped by federal judges in Florida. The appellate court in Atlanta is one that, again, it's more Republican dominated. And DeSantis has gotten some support from that court when it comes to, revising policy and when the appeal of a lower federal judge's ruling against him gets brought up to it. So DeSantis has had some good luck there on the judicial side as well.
Right. And like DeSantis, Trump has really worked to reshape the judiciary during his first administration. So we'll see how friendly some of these judges are. Biden did the same thing. I mean, they really rammed a lot of judges through the confirmation process towards the end of his presidency. So, there's definitely a mix there. And I'm sure a lot of these executive orders will be challenged and wind their way through the court system, and we'll see what happens with them. Will Trump's blitz of executive orders out of the starting gate included a number targeted at his signature campaign promise of cracking down on undocumented immigrants. He announced he's sending troops to the border, something Floridians are familiar with after DeSantis did the same thing with the National Guard. Anna, Florida really has a pretty large immigrant population. The state will be greatly affected as deportations begin. What are you watching for?
So I'm watching for ICE raids, really.
Right.
There's been some rumors of ICE raids in Detroit, in Tijuana, but nothing so far here in Florida. I checked yesterday with a source down in South Florida, and she said that there's lots of rumors, but nothing confirmed. So right now I'm trying to see, if it really is a day one thing for Trump and for DeSantis to start rounding up undocumented immigrants and sending them back. So far, again, I haven't heard anything. I have heard of people leaving on their own accord, So, but that's not that's been happening for a while. There's probably been an uptick, really, but
and part of that is Florida, right? Because they passed a stronger law in Florida where you have to check people's immigration status as a business, and that was starting to take effect, and that was making some immigrants nervous. So this is sort of a continuation of that here.
Yeah, it's a continuation of that. Really, so that really pushed some immigrants away, definitely. But they're still here. They're still working. I think there's some roundabout ways that that businesses have been able to kind of skirt the issue, really. I can tell you this, that this is different. This is very different than that.
Right.
The fear is different this time. So I'm honestly, I'm literally after this, I'm going to go and contact some sources, drive out to some places I know where I've spoken with people who have entered the country illegally, where I've spoken to them before, and just to see what's up.
What kind of communities are we talking about here? Are these people that work more in agriculture, tourism? I mean, construction? Those tend to be industries that have a lot of immigrants.
I'm going to tell you this: if there is a restaurant you like, that whole kitchen staff is probably undocumented. So this isn't just like, your strawberries are going to be $10. This isn't just, your roofing is going to be a big deal. These are the people who clean the hospitals. These are the people who make your food. These are, your construction workers who build right down the street here from the Capitol. There's a huge apartment complex that just got built. Most of that was undocumented workers, from what I hear. That's what some people have told me. So, this isn't just like, you're farm workers and no one wants to pick, grapes anymore.
Right. And I think Ag Secretary Wilton Simpson said that a lot of the farm workers in Florida are actually here on visas, that they don't think that they'll be affected that much.
So H-1B visas, I believe, or maybe it's not that one. It's not the H-1B. It's the other visa. But yes, a lot of them are. And what they do, what these companies do, is they put them in these like old buses and they drive them all around the state. Last summer, I think I saw a good 200 people in line cashing their checks at a place down here in Tallahassee because they had just finished, a couple days up here. And so now they're going back down to South Florida. They all had visas. So that he's not wrong there, but a lot of people also don't have visas. So
right. Yeah, I've been driving over to Mar-a-Lago, and as I drive across the state, there's huge immigrant populations, across the central part of Florida. Antonio, where you are in South Florida, a large immigrant population. What are you watching for?
Yeah, okay. I think we need to come to understand a few things. That what is called, quote unquote, illegal in this country, in many cases really is not. And the key comes down for Florida to 3 letters, TPS, which is temporary protected status.
Right.
There are millions of people in the state. And
those are a lot of people from
Haiti, Venezuela, Honduras, Guatemala, all those countries. These are people that are here in the United States with permission. They have papers. They can work. The
And
problem
famously
is
during the campaign, when Trump was talking about the immigrants in the
in
town
Ohio.
in Springfield, Ohio,
Ohio,
those were people who had legal status.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're legal. But here's the thing: it's legal status, but it's what's called temporary protective status, which they're here with the basically the permission and the benevolence of the executive branch, the president, basically because their country has gone through some sort of upheaval. It could be natural disaster, it could be political, it could be for whatever reason, and they're allowed to be in this country as safe harbor. The question is, does the new administration, do they pull away that TPS standing? And if they do, that's what then leads to huge numbers of people who are now in the country undocumented or illegal, whatever term you want to use. That's really the key. That is what sends the fear and the shudders through everybody, from the person who's here with TPS protection to the person who employs them. Because all of a sudden, that's where the labor market in Florida takes a beating across the board. I mean, we're talking about tourism, we're talking about, yes, construction, all the major industries. In fact, there are people who are working white collar, professional jobs who are here with TPS protection. So I think that's a key thing. Beyond that, I have a source at the Department of Corrections, and there are, it's a number of thousands of men and women who are in the Florida, prison system who are under deportable status. And the question is, do you deport them now? Do you wait till they serve out their sentences? And part of the argument is that if you deport them now, they go to their countries and then they're free to roam. At least here they're paying for their crime. But then the question is, but then it's the taxpayer that's covering it. So all of that stuff, but that's not, the people in the prison system, and even the classic person who's living in this country totally undocumented, that's not going to create upheaval in your labor market. What will create upheaval in the labor market is something like removing TPS, or even coming to the conclusion that people who have entered the border, who crossed the border since January 2021, who crossed the border, reported, and are working their cases through the immigration system, if you were somehow to issue an executive order to cancel all those proceedings, which I think, obviously that would then lead to all sorts of lawsuits and so forth. But no, that's where when we're talking about, many, many millions of people being deported, that's what we're talking about, is when you go to that extent. So far, we haven't seen that.
Well, Antonio, another thing that I think is important is, some people are even considering DACA recipients. They consider them, they're not here.
They're here
legal status.
Because they're executive action. That's an executive action that can be removed.
Yes.
And those are the dreamers, the people that came here as young children. And they've talked about trying to include the dreamers in some kind of immigration deal. So we'll see. I mean, they're going to have a giant bill that's going to have immigration stuff in it, and that's going to be Trump's signature legislation. We'll see what he includes in that.
And he has been open in the past. Back in 2018, he offered up a deal for the DACA and the Dreamers to get as part of the funding of the wall. Then it didn't fall. I don't want to go into that whole history, but it fell apart, and ultimately we had a government shutdown for the longest ever over a lot of that. And then he went to get military funding for the wall. But so we'll see. Right now, though, that's what, if you're looking at the Florida labor market, it's those groups.
Yeah. You make a good point about TPS. That would be just a exponential increase, especially here in Florida, and the amount of people that could be affected.
I'd also just like to say that asylum is also a legal way of coming over. That is a legal process. A lot of conservatives don't believe it is. But a lot of, the asylum process of coming to the border, showing up, claiming asylum, doing the paperwork, that is a legal process. That is a legal way of coming to the United States. That is not how a lot of people view it. Those people are, Trump signed a lot of executive orders, 78, I believe, on his first day. A lot of them were targeted to the border and immigration. You talk to people, you talk to conservatives who say that asylum process is not okay. They canceled the CBP1 app, right? That was a legal way to come to the United States, and that does not exist anymore. So these are things that, Antonio is totally right. Like, that usual, that kind of stereotype of, crossing the border. Yes, that still happens, but there are a lot of people who are in the middle, who are in the middle of this legal battle, that are going to get stuck. And it's a lot of them are gonna, I don't know, we'll all just kind of find out what happens.
Yeah. And we don't really know how aggressive they're going to be, but it seems like their instinct with the Trump administration is to be aggressive as possible. How quickly they do that out of the gate is a big question. They've been trying to downplay it a little bit and say that we're only going to go after people who have criminal records initially. So we'll see what happens when these ICE raids really start to kick off. Well, one other thing that we're really watching here in Florida as the new Trump administration kicks off is the relationship between Trump and DeSantis. They obviously had a very contentious relationship during the GOP presidential primary, but since then, DeSantis has really tried to work to get closer to Trump. And we saw that this week when Trump put out an executive order trying to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. DeSantis was maybe the first person to really adopt that in public office. He put out he did a emergency order this week with this winter storm that affected Florida, dumped record amounts of snow, and he called it, John, the Gulf of America in that emergency order. There's been other things where we've seen DeSantis try to get close to Trump here. He was trying to do a special session on immigration to kind of push Trump's immigration agenda. It really looks like he's trying to be the tip of the spear here for Trump.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think we're going to see more of it along the way here because, we've already had the governor and his followers have worked to erase references to racial and gender diversity from school books. That's something that, here, let me start over again. Have I missed a lead in here?
I kind of scrambled it a little bit.
Okay. But
yeah, I was going to lead in with, are we going to see the Gulf of America in Florida school books? But I messed that up.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I was ready to respond to. But well, I could start up from that. That's a good point, Zach. I think DeSantis is looking to really ingratiate himself with the Trump White House and kind of bring himself back into some level of relevance on the national scale. And we've already seen how DeSantis can make this work. His followers have worked to erase references to racial and gender diversity in school books. They've tinkered with Black history to make slavery look like a trade school. That was another thing that they did recently in the last couple of years when it came to what was allowed in Florida textbooks. And
pretty soon we might see the Gulf of America in Florida textbooks here.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be the next thing. Really, the body of water to our west being called the Gulf of America, that's something it's never been called except in the mind of the brander-in-chief, Donald Trump. So, I think this is all part of DeSantis trying to being on a mission to regain the trust of Donald Trump. He was a rival once. He was he saw Trump as his mentor, but they've been at odds for more than a year now. And of course, we've talked in the past about the Susie Wiles relationship, where DeSantis has a very awkward bond with Susie Wiles, having pushed her out of political circles a couple of years ago after she had sort of resurrected his 2018 campaign.
And that's still raw. I mean, Susie Wiles, I think in the most recent interview that I saw of her was like, she was pretty, she still seemed pretty upset with DeSantis.
Yeah, I don't think there's any love there. And she has a direct pipeline to the president. So DeSantis is trying to change that trajectory all around. But the special session for next week is an example of it, with the governor getting an attaboy already from the president for saying he wants the state to be ready to enact whatever deportation policies the White House promotes. And I think we're going to see him green light either legislation or somehow a change by the state's Department of Education in textbooks to make references to the Gulf of America. The state warred with textbook manufacturers 2 different times over social justice, math, and history textbooks. So now geography looks next. He'll be rejecting whatever the companies that provide schools with textbooks that they have followed all these ideas that have become targets of the right. So DeSantis is hoping to be president someday after his failed campaign last year. And I think, he's got to keep relevant in this world where Trump really blots out much of the political sunlight. So DeSantis will grab every gimmick he can. And I think that includes the Gulf of America right now.
Yeah. And to bring it full circle, like I said earlier, we really are seeing with Trump sort of this Make America Florida agenda, where he's really adopted a lot of DeSantis's culture war stuff and really embraced that. And now we're seeing DeSantis really embrace what Trump is doing right back around here and really push, trying to be one of the first people to push Trump's agenda in the country and make Florida really reflect the new presidency.
Maybe we're going to see DeSantis send the Florida National Guard to Greenland next to help raise the flag over the Trump contested land.
We'll take back the Panama Canal as well. Well, that wraps up another episode of Inside Florida Politics. I want to thank our production guru, Rob Landers, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We're out of here.